Welcome to the Free Cities podcast. My name is Timothy Allen, and this is the official podcast of the Free Cities Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode number 35 of the Free Cities podcast. Okay, so as some of you may recall, back in March, I was in Warsaw at the Weekend Capitalismu conference, and fortunately for me, at that time, the world's first ever Bitcoin film festival was also happening just around the corner. So, of course, I took the opportunity to meet as many of the film directors present as I could, and managed to record a number of interesting interviews, of which this will be the first. Pierre Corbin is a film director and co-founder of the festival, who was also showing his latest film at the event. Titled The Great Reset and the Rise of Bitcoin, this conversation with Pierre is a deep dive into the film, which also reflects, of course, his ideas and observations of the current macroeconomic situation that we all find ourselves in. Now, some of the many subjects touched upon in this discussion include the gold standard, Venetian war bonds, Ming Dynasty hyperinflation, debt cycles, social networks, Bitcoin, of course, ChatGPT, CBDCs, AI, UBI, the IMF. Apparently, if you love acronyms, you're going to love this episode. So stay tuned. And of course, also, don't forget, we are actually hosting our own festival of Free Cities in Prague this October. So jump on over to libertyinourlifetime.org to secure your tickets to the Free Cities conference. And failing that, just sit back, as always, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Pierre Corbin. By the way, I watched a brilliant film last night called Triangle of Sadness. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
You've watched it?
Yes.
I loved that.
It's the guys that get abandoned on an island, right? And,
right.
Yes.
So funny. Such a scathing... Well, I don't know whether it's scathing. I thought it was. But the the observation of the kind of... contemporary woke rich crowd is really good. It's painful to watch, actually. The two protagonists are like, you know, the worst. The guy is a really sort of like confused, effeminate, you know, bloke, and the woman's a sort of conniving influencer. You know, it's just like he's nailed the worst aspects of modern humans. Is really, really impressive. I've just been telling everyone about it. Like, watch this film. It's really good. It's really good and beautifully shot. I mean, really.
And then it all gets flipped on its head. I mean, I found it very surprising how. No, I don't want to spoil anything actually.
No, you go on. You can say it. It doesn't matter.
But how all of a sudden, like, all hell breaks loose, and the ship sinks, and then the whole situation on the island gets completely reversed. I mean, I think it was cool, and all of this in the end you find out for literally nothing.
but also when in the big scene where in the storm when it's such a great vision of the super rich, like eating all this exceptionally, you know, over the top food, and then vomiting it up, and then shit everywhere and puke. And it's such a like a truism. I mean, I've dipped my toes into that echelon of society a number of times in my life, and it's very vacuous. It's like that, you know, that kind of fake concern But actually, it's just no one cares about anything at that point. It's money and control and all those horrible human characteristics. And yeah, I was really impressed. I'm going to give it another watch as well because I was laughing so much as well. It's really funny.
It is
dark humor, really funny dark humor. But
yeah, well, in the same kind of genre, have you watched the film Babylon?
I don't think I have. Has that got the same guy in it? The guy who plays the captain on the ship. He's Woody Harrelson. Is he in that as well?
No, in that there's Brad Pitt, there's Margot Robbie, and it's about Hollywood in the 1920s and these great times of Hollywood. But there's a few scenes that are, I mean, at some point in the film, they start talking about how Hollywood changed back then, and the people that started financing this were top banks, and it became very political and financial kind of game. And while this happens, there's Margot Robbie, her character is at this super fancy party, there's Rothschilds, there's all of these beautiful people. And she just goes crazy. She loses it because she doesn't belong there. She's an actress, and she goes out making a full scene. And at the end of that scene, she literally just vomits on the floor in front of all of these people, and I thought it was a great way to, especially for a film about Hollywood, that was a pretty big film and was somehow eliminated from any kind of Oscars, even though I think really deserved a few prizes, at least for the music. How, new films try and literally vomit on the system.
Well, the interesting thing about, let's say the one I just watched, Triangle of Sadness, is that in the same sense that, do you remember when Ricky Gervais used to give scathing speeches at the Oscars or one of those big award ceremonies, and you listen to him and you think, wow, that's incredible, but you wonder whether anyone in the audience really gives a shit. Really, they don't. Like they're being like, in a way, Ricky Gervais is laughing at them. Do they care? Probably not. And the same goes with this film, because I noticed it was well received at Cannes. Okay, obviously Cannes is the embodiment of the Cannes Film Festival is the embodiment of what the film is basically alluding to, taking showing the vacuousness of this super wealthy lifestyle, which is so I do wonder whether any of this stuff really matters. We were talking about this yesterday. Actually, I've interviewed all the film directors from this film festival. We've all had little mini discussions about this, that, and the other. And we had a good one about whether art even really changes people's minds.
Right.
And I'm not so sure it does. Certainly, I think documentaries, film documentaries do 100%. And I know that because I've watched, like in the case of your documentary, I watched it and I thought, bloody hell, you covered a lot of ground in this film. It's not just like, here's a little story about Bitcoin or what it is, or, what the financial times we're going through, what's more than likely to happen. It covers almost everything. Like as someone who's within the Bitcoin world myself, you touched upon most of the commonly known memes. I take it that was intentional, and that as also a result of you just knowing what everyone's talking about in the Bitcoin world. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. But at the same time, it wasn't necessarily planned, because I just started writing. And I wasn't sure how much I was going to cover. I just, the more I was writing, the more I was, because I was writing and editing simultaneously, because I was just doing all the work myself. So as I was progressing, I was trying to figure out, the total flow for the film and just adding topics. At first, I thought I was going to make a, 20-minute video. In the end, I did an hour, 20 minutes.
Well, I've had exactly the same experience on a number of occasions. And I think I started making a Bitcoin film once. The same thing happened. I actually ended up just giving up in the end because it was too complicated. And it's a bit like, every person that thinks they understand Bitcoin knows this feeling when they try and explain it to someone else anyway. You begin somewhere and then you start sort of like going down this explanatory route. And before you know it, there are forks going off to the side and there are new tunnels and there are new places. And you have to be really disciplined to know what it is you want to say, because everyone comes at it from a different angle. I think when you're making a film, it's even harder because you don't even know who your audience are. You don't know who's watching that. And what happened to me, interestingly, and what didn't happen to you, was I ended up coming to the conclusion I was making a film for Bitcoiners. Right. And that's not necessarily an important film to make. Bitcoiners don't need to watch more films about Bitcoiners. Other people need to watch films and understand, the macro environment we live in, what Bitcoin is, why it exists, why Bitcoiners think it's the solution to almost, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to overstate it, but it's the solution to a lot of things, apparently. Mm-hmm. So first of all, congratulations on managing to get it all in.
Thanks.
But what I thought might be quite nice, because it really is such a informational film. Mm. Maybe we could go through the film and just, obviously, as a filmmaker, I'm going to guess that every single line, every single scene, every single...
I mean, I've watched it a few times.
Right, okay. So it might be an idea to do that, and just to have a discussion about using the narrative of the film to sort of dictate where we go, because it's very informative. And I like the way you start with the kind of macro environment of the world. So why don't you start there? I think a few of the things you touch on at the start: gold standard, debt cycles, what even debt cycles are, why they're bad for us. So maybe I mean, I learned some new things about the gold standard actually from this film. Okay. Why don't you start there?
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason why the gold standard matters so much is because from the moment we dropped off the gold standard, and this happened in Europe, that was the first places where it happened in 1914. The first one was the British Central Bank. Well, this allowed for the financing of the Great War, because of course, from the moment you have helicopter money, from the moment you can print as much money as you want, well, then you can also buy as many things as you want.
Maybe you should, just in case anyone listening to this doesn't even really understand what the gold standard is, maybe unpack what is a gold standard. Yeah.
So the gold standard is the idea that the money that you produce as a nation is backed by these gold reserves. So in theory, the way it should work is that, if you have $100 worth of paper money, you should have $100 worth of gold somewhere at the central bank. Of course, $100 is nothing. Think, millions, billions. And this is, a good way of creating money, because of course it means that it is backed by something. You can always sell the gold for even some foreign currency if the local currency turned bad. Anyone can be on their own gold standard if you choose to, because again, it's a matter of holding the same amount of gold as you hold cash. And this is how central banks were, from their creation, they were making sure that people would trust the value of their paper money because everything was backed by gold. The reason why paper money was invented in the first place was in order to make trade more, simple, easier, and international, thanks to this backing of gold, because everyone just trusted the value that was behind it.
And the way I liked to imagine it, the way it actually happened really is that gold is difficult to transmit. And, transacting in gold is relatively difficult, especially with large amounts of gold. So paper tokens were invented that people trusted. And then the paper tokens were the things that were traded, not the gold. Yeah. And then by 1914...
Yeah, by 1914, central banks in Europe decide to just let go of that. The first one was the UK. Part of the reason for that is because they were, losing their status, their position internationally, and it just required them to have way more cash for bigger expenses, as they were, losing their status of global reserve currency. Other nations followed, Germany, France, and 1914 is the year the First World War started.
And prior to the ability to print money to go to war, How were governments funding wars under a gold standard?
So I think a good example of that is the Italian cities, kind of around the 17th, 16th century, I believe. The way it worked there is simply citizens weren't fighting wars. Governments, if they decided to, they would simply pay mercenaries and they would go to war for them. So the wars were kind of happening in the background and people could live their normal lives. Their cities weren't necessarily destroyed. It was just at a smaller scale than what we've had since World War I.
And presumably prior to during the gold standard as well, if you really wanted to fight a war, you either had to spend your gold or persuade people to, I don't know what, buy bonds from you, like war bonds. When did war bonds start? That's quite later on, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually, because I know that, around the 16th century, war bonds already did exist. And depending on the societies and also on the cities, because of course the best example of that, I think, is Italy of that time, because each city was independent and they all had their own governance system. And it just depended on the influence that each ruler had, because they would force the rich people to buy these bonds, or they would just use whatever money they managed to raise separately. But usually it was, the rich people from the city that would just be forced in some cases, especially depending on the popularity of the ruler, of course, because if you're popular among the poorer people of the society, then you can set up rules such as forcing the rich people to buy certain things to finance some activities, including war.
Okay, so go through the sort of timeline of the gold standard then.
You mean the whole timeline of the gold standard? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, maybe. I mean, the gold, presumably that starts 5,000 years ago or something,
yeah.
Does it?
I don't really know the whole story of the gold standard, but one thing is certain is that, we humans have valued gold for a very long time. I mean, gold is everywhere in any kind of ancient mythology, and remains of it are found, in ancient Egypt. That's 5,000 years ago. And even before that, we know that gold was something that was valued and that we've realized was something hard and that wasn't degrading over time and that we could use to exchange value. And that's for thousands of years. And I think it even goes further than we even know based on evidence that we found. And I think it's going to continue this way, right? I mean, gold, why would that change? It's still the same properties of it being scarce and of it being, non-degradable. So it holds value over a long time. So I think
easy to divide as well.
Easy to divide as well, exactly.
Yeah. Just some of the characteristics it has make it difficult to be certainly a currency.
Yes.
I.e., it's fine if you're using gold coins, I suppose. Not that anyone really wants to carry gold coins anymore, but gold bullion bars to pay for your house would require quite a lot of expenditure, even just to transport them, let alone to store them.
Yeah, and I actually that's one of the problems that we were faced as a society. As international trade grew, and the technologies that we developed allowed us to trade even faster. I mean, think about what we have now. A gold standard would be impossible. We're all working just based off ledgers, and ledgers. We've been using ledgers for thousands of years as well, right? This double entry accounting has been around for literally thousands of years. And it's not that much of a problem. But when the intensity of international trade increases, then just gold doesn't cut it anymore. Because, of course, you want to be able to transfer certain value to people, but in a very easy kind of way. And this is why we moved from just trading with gold to some paper kind of currency, because it just, simplified it. And as long as everyone trusted in the fact that there was gold reserves backing it, well, then there was no problem using some kind of alternative. Because although gold is very hard money, we have many different societies that have used many different forms of money, right? Whether it was paper backed or not. I mean, it's not like we invented paper money when we got off the gold standard here in Europe. already a few thousand years ago in China, they tried the experiment of paper money. And of course, they were the very first one, actually. It's the first evidence of paper money. And of course, how did it happen? I mean, how did it end?
I don't know.
Well, helicopter money.
When was that?
Yeah, I think it was around the 14th century.
And was it prior to that in China? Was it a gold standard too?
Yes, that's right. And well, I mean, they did have it a bit more complicated because they had different regions that had different currencies that would use gold and silver, but they would just mark their. It wasn't really coins, but kind of. I mean, this is how we could, from our perspective of using coins, because that's what we know we had here in Europe. But they had different shapes, like a sword, a shield. There was 4 different ones for 4 different regions. And then, one of these dynasties just started printing money because it was great for international trade, and then it was completely abused.
And was there hyperinflation?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, right. Yeah. I didn't know. That's the first I've heard of that story. I'm going to look into that.
Yeah.
Really?
Very interesting.
Okay, so after 1914 then, gold standard, what's going on in the world?
Yeah, so in the world, all big nations, apart from the US, they get rid of the gold standard. The gold standard got rid of it, in 1933, they already started that, but when they really got off the gold standard was in 1971. And they got off the gold standard, let's say, for the entire world, essentially, because after World War II, the rest of the world agreed to peg their currency and their gold reserve, just transfer all of this to the US and in exchange get US dollars. And in 1971, just Nixon decided to never give the gold back to anyone, and the only thing they could use was the US dollar. And this really got off the entire world of the gold standard.
And we all know that famous bit of footage.
Yeah.
Ending the convertibility of the dollar
into gold.
Yes. I've heard that so many times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wasn't. I was just being born in 1971, actually, but I wonder how people responded to that. The average person. Do you think anyone really got it? I mean, like nowadays, people seem to be much more economic savvy, especially with regard to things like macroeconomics and what is money. I never thought about money until, 5 years ago, say. And I think that's pretty standard. And and a lot of people I know now, even people that work in finance, never really ask themselves what is money. Yeah. But I wonder what it was like in 1971 when you see the president of America saying, okay, we're no longer going to honor your debts of gold. So you can no longer claim your gold back. You just keep the paper.
Yeah. I think, it was different times. I don't think, because 1971, right after that, following that, I think in 74 and such, there was high inflation in the US and around the world, kind of. And of course, it was a result of that. But, for France, I based this on conversations I've had with my dad around that, let's say, because he was around there back then. I wasn't. And he didn't understand what that was, what happened. And he just realizes that there was high inflation back then. And just as, while I was pitching him Bitcoin and the inflation and, how central banks works and kind of the topics of my film, he was saying, oh, yeah, but, Pierre, like in the 70s, we had a few years where there was 15% inflation. That was really high. And like, we got over it and it's okay. Yeah. And I was like, well, okay, but that's not the point,
Well, the funny thing is about the current monetary system is the few times I'd thought about it, throughout my life, and even when I'd questioned it and gone, that seems really unfair, I always defaulted to, oh, well, I've just got to try and make the best of it. I never thought about an alternative because no one spoke about it. And arguably, we didn't have an alternative that fitted the 21st century. Obviously, I'm alluding to something like Bitcoin here. Because our alternative was to go back to the gold standard, and then we know now you can easily decipher what the problems of the gold standard are in the current age. I mean, the internet has literally changed everything. The internet I now see as the thing that's changed everything. I think we see a lot of these technological advancements going on now and think, wow, that's amazing. But it was the internet that started it all. The fact that we all got connected in a digital way, you know.
Yeah, and you see that's also part of why what happened in 1971 with Nixon, I don't think too many people knew about it because there wasn't the internet back then. How do you get information about things? You only get them from official sources that we know just tailor their news to what is correct to say and what they want the population to believe. Today, we're in a completely different stage. Right now, you know, we can listen to Christine Lagarde tell us that everything is great and they've got everything under control. But you have so much more information that is different from what she's saying, that is really backed with a lot of evidence, and it allows you to just think more independently, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, I think we'll look back at this period of 50 odd years and see, I mean, I think most people now understand we're living through tumultuous times. But I think it'll be much easier to look back in hindsight and see why. And the main thing that changed, as you say, during this period was the availability of information. The gatekeepers disappeared, information became free, and as a result, kind of like chaos ensued.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, of course, which I think, I mean, it's normal because, you know, it gives the people an extra tool, something that allows them to gain a certain independence. In this case, it would be intellectual independence. Momentarily, right now, you know, we also see some of the negative effects of the internet because social networks developed in a certain way, and I think there's, you know, space for this to change down the road. But, you know, we also see some of these momentary negative side effects that can lead to certain manipulation through this technology. But it's not a problem of the internet. It's a problem of the social networks. It's just what layers you build on top of it and how people end up using them. And I think a lot of it has to do with monetization and who gets paid and how. So, but, you know, maybe we can get into the future of social networks.
Yeah, I'd love to. Your film's called The Great Reset, the main title of it, which is prominent here. We're talking about a Great Reset. And I think the Great Reset has two sides. It's the kind of conspiracy theory version of the Great Reset,
right?
Which, you know, arguably a large amount of it is not necessarily even a conspiracy theory. I'm just calling it that to identify it. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Great Reset, which is, in a way, the kind of cultural version of it. Talk about debt cycles and the way that central banks deal with the cycles of debt, for want of a better word, because I think that ties in very closely with the whole idea of the Great Reset.
Yeah, no, it 100% does. So we have what we call short-term and long-term debt cycles. They're we accepted them in our economy, particularly the short-term debt cycles, because we know them, you know, as these boom and bust cycles, is the idea that it's normal for our economy to expand and then to contract. And at that point, you know, there's huge bankruptcies, there's, you know, people lose jobs, all of these negative, just a financial crisis. The last one being 2008. It's hard to say, actually, I'd say right now, but, you know, that's not how it's categorized by mainstream media. So officially, the last one would have been in 2008. And so there's, you know, these shorter ones that we use, that are a result of credit expansion and easy money that is just distributed into the economy. And then, you know, we've gone a bit too crazy with that. So central banks decide to start, you know, increasing interest rates. And this, of course, makes people take less credit. So this expansion, this economical expansion that we have just, you know, goes down. And you know, we think it's a normal thing. That's because central banks have pushed in our minds the fact that 2% inflation is always positive. And in order to get inflation, you need to produce more money. And, you know, we need more money to expand our economic reach. And part of it makes sense, to be honest, especially if we're working on a global US dollar. Then there was this big period where, of course, the US economy had to push the US dollar as far as possible and expand its reach. Therefore, they obviously had to print more money, and they had, you know, different ledgers, let's say, that they built allowing that. But in all of that, there's also the long-term debt cycle, which is 75 to 100 years. And these are often correlated to the rise and fall of a global reserve currency. And right now, it seems like we are at this turning point. And in fact, it would have started earlier. The strong point that could have led to this fall of the US dollar was the 2008 financial crisis, when helicopter money really started in order to bail out the banks, because banks were too big to fail. If the banks failed, then no one would have access to their money. And I mean, sure, it led to this helicopter money scenario, but at the same time, we don't necessarily know how bad it would have gotten if no one had access to their, bank accounts.
And debt cycles, by their nature, are a result of top-down control, right? Management, top-down management of the economy. Is that right? So, like you say, as if you're in control, if you're trying to control the monetary system as the Federal Reserve tries to do so, you've got a few ways you can do it. One is the issuance of currency.
Yeah.
That apparently stimulates the market. And one is raising interest rates, which should stagnate the market a little bit.
Yep.
It forces people to stop spending and start saving. And the result is debt cycles. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much, because this is what leads to controlled debt cycles, basically. Before that, there were some financial crises that existed, but they were usually, market related. It was maybe bad crops a certain year. Now the difference is that all of this is just much more centralized. And because it's centralized, then it's these centralized decision makers that will have an influence on these debt cycles directly.
Okay, so talk about then the results of debt cycles. Like, what did you learn from making the film about debt cycles?
So I think, and that's really how I transitioned in the film after mentioning the debt cycles, is the long-term effect of it is just high inflation and loss in purchasing power. And this, it can be explored in the short term when it comes to these short-term debt cycles, because of course, all of a sudden everyone, you lose your jobs and so on. Like, a lot of people end up losing their purchasing power. But over the long run, throughout all of these shorter debt cycles, these centralized authorities continue to print money. So, and in a more aggressive way. I mean, right now, what's happening with the banking crisis today in 2023, they're already printing more money than they did in 2008, right? But today there's no crisis. Yeah? But it's this idea that once you pour a huge amount of liquidity in the market, then increasing the supply of money so much will, of course, create high inflation, which we've been experiencing the past two years. And it puts you in this loop of needing even more inflation, because you need to distribute even more money, because people just can't afford living normally anymore. So that's the third point that central banks and governments, the actions that they take. The third point is increased welfare spending, because obviously you're making your population poorer and poorer. You need to start to support them even more. But this just accelerates this loop, right, of making our society more addicted to inflation, to rather the increase of money supply, because this is how you can redistribute some of these funds. And, the whole society gets addicted and gets, into this accelerated loop of more money and more inflation and loss of purchasing power versus other currencies.
People often call it kicking the can down the road.
Exactly.
Well, as far as I understand it anyway, there is, once you commit to that strategy, there isn't much else you can do. If you're reducing interest rates, they just keep going down, which is the case. Interest rates have been constantly going down, and we hit zero and negative rates in the last few years. There's not a lot else you can do beyond that. You can't reduce, presumably you can reduce rates further into the negative. But
I mean, in theory, you can. Yeah, some countries have done it, right?
Yeah.
Until they reversed last year, where they started going back up, but very aggressively, and that's part of the reason why banks are suffering now, right?
So, what do you think?
Limits.
What do you think the Federal Reserve, the ECB, these central banks? What do you think they're thinking off the record right now? How are they going to get themselves out of this predicament? You can't reduce interest rates any further in that direction to control. If you increase interest rates, you've got another problem on your hand. And printing more money to stimulate the economy is the only other official method possible, and that causes huge inflation, which then, I mean, the whole system is like a can being kicked down the road, right? So, what's their off-the-record solution, do you think?
So, I think that right now the problem that they have is a debt problem. It's just there's way too much of it, and you kind of have two solutions. Number one, you decide to eliminate part of that debt, but it means that, of course, a lot of people may lose a lot of money along the way. So, this would lead to a certain reset in the economy, but it would lead to, it would have a lot of negative effects, obviously, and this would be, without a doubt, triggered by them directly, right? And, they would get fired themselves. So governments would lose faith of their population. There would be likely a lot of revolts. It wouldn't look good. For sure. I think it's easier to control a high inflationary environment because, you can just use force and contain your population for a longer period of time rather than a hard reset. Because this is what they can do. The only thing they can do is, if you take the debt that there is in the world and compare it to the monetary supply available, well then if you manage to increase the monetary supply, so the total money in the world, then the size of that debt is going to lower because there's just more money available. And this is a solution to the debt bubble, right? They don't say that officially, right? I think the solution that they have in order to be able to make this a bit more of a smoother transition while allowing them to have more control on people, because again, either you destroy debt or you inflate money like crazy. In both cases, people aren't going to be happy. But one of them is more over the long term. If you manage to give certain alternatives, such as central bank digital currencies, then it creates this illusion of an alternative. And you can, get people out of that extremely indebted world and transfer them into something that seems like it isn't. But in the process, it allows you to have more control on how people spend their money. And if ever there are some bigger revolts, you just, take cops to hit on people's faces, like what's happening in France right now for the past couple of weeks.
When you mentioned the longer term debt cycles, what you said about 60 or 70 year cycles, that's what we're at. That's what we're at the end of now. Is that right?
Yeah.
So prior to that, how were those cycles dealt with previously?
You mean prior to?
No, prior to this one. So the last one was around World War II's time, wasn't it? If you go back 60 years or 70 years, you're in the 1940s or whatever.
Right.
So what was the solution back then at the end of the last debt cycle?
So I think, and I didn't do that much research into it, but the way I see it is that back then we weren't such an interconnected world. It was more of who has the most financial influence around the world, and they would simply lose that status. So there would be more trouble within their own nations directly. You can think, there was, we can go back a couple and we can think about it in terms of reserve currencies, because there's a strong correlation between this long-term debt cycle and the life of reserve currencies, because the US dollar has been around for about 100 years. These debt cycles are 75 to 100 years. Before the US dollar, it was the British pound. And they kind of let go of their status to give this to the United States. It lasted about 100 years, and before that, it was the Dutch in the Netherlands. They had reserve currency. They were the bigger banking power around the world, and it kind of ends the same way everywhere. It's just locally at home, they go a bit too crazy, and it leads to a lot of crazy situations like I think from the Netherlands, the famous one is the tulip bubble, right? That everyone uses to compare it to Bitcoin today. But, it's just when you lose this status, then all of this money that you've sent abroad suddenly comes back home and leads to extremely high inflation and leads to certain prices to be, rather assets to be priced irrationally. And just people going for some refuge kind of investments as they can. And then everyone gets wrecked.
And the advantage in the modern age of being the US dollar is you have a huge amount of potential liquidity in the world, because it's the whole world in some shape or form using the dollar. Even if they're not using it as their currency, their businesses are settling in it on an international scale, oil, all these kind of things. And it's much harder to create a high inflation, I suppose, now, because the liquidity is still getting sucked up by people around the world. Talk about inflation then, and there's a bit in the film about CPI and how inflation is even calculated, which is also a little bit dubious.
Yes. Yeah, so CPI is the Consumer Price Index. And so it's calculated by central banks. It's mostly tool for economists that can, just use it as a benchmark, compare themselves to other countries. But each country can kind of create their own CPI. Of course, in the Eurozone, for example, it'll be more standardized, but they can still influence and show their own CPI numbers based on what they decide to include there. Because the CPI is a basket of products, but not in the literal sense. If it was the literal sense of, a basket, just the way you go shopping, maybe it would be better for day-to-day people to be able to position their purchasing power based on that. But of course, they include many different assets that don't necessarily concern everyone. There's some real estate part of it. There's some financial assets part of it. And these will inflate more or less. And governments, they can just add and remove assets from this basket of products. And of course, it means that they can manipulate it and they can change it. And that's what I also show in the film, quite, with some animations and pricing, is the fact that from one year to another, the CPI, the basket of products that is taken into account in the CPI can change, which means that after that change, then the basket of products that you're following is no longer the same basket of products. So, of course, and Safety Namusi explains this very nicely in a quote that I also use in the film, that is that, if you earn, I think it's $10 a day, and you buy every day a steak worth $10. So all of your money goes into that. But there's, inflation and hyperinflation that kicks in. After a while, your steak is now worth $100. Well, if you still make $10, you're not going to be able to buy that steak anymore. So you're going to go for a certain alternative. You're going to go for, in that case, he talks about the shitstorm that are soy burgers. And
I can't imagine he'd eat a soy burger, right, even in hyperinflation. Anyway,
yes. And so, this steak burger, though, is worth $10. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to change your basket of products. Instead of having just this one steak that is now worth $100, you're going to move on to a cheaper alternative. But in that case, if it was a year-to-year comparison, well, then the CPI hasn't changed because you've just replaced one product with another.
Which makes it obviously very difficult to compare the present with the past. In fact, impossible.
Yeah, well, I think, that's why I say it's a tool for economists. It's not for day-to-day people, but it's something that, because it's so easily manipulated, and it's something that economists value so much because, this is how they base their macro comparisons. It's a number that has been, politicized. And now this is what politicians use and bang on people's heads to tell them this is what your purchasing power really looks like. And in France, I think last year, CPI reached 5.5%, which is one of the lowest in the Eurozone. like how? Like, I mean, come on, it's only because they have a different definition of the CPI than others. And you see that throughout the whole Eurozone, how some are going to have more or less. And I mean, if you're using the same currency as your neighbor, you have similar spending habits, it's going to be about the same inflation. It can't be such a big difference.
I think everyone knows that inflation is running pretty high because of just I'm a creature of what's the word? I do the same. I eat the same things most of the time on a daily basis. You know what I mean? I go out and buy things, and I've watched them rise in the last couple of years from something that would have cost me £2 is now costing me £3.50 in some cases, and obviously that's almost that's 40% up, or it's almost doubling in price. But the other thing you notice if you look hard enough is that some of the products that aren't going up as much are just getting smaller.
Right. Shrinkflation.
Or the ingredients are changing. Yeah. And that's another way that people hide inflation. So I suppose the CPI results that are kind of released to the public are just there to make people to say everything's okay. Yeah. Is that right? They don't really they're not useful to the average person other than to look at them and go, oh, everything's fine. I can just carry on as normal.
That's my opinion exactly. And, that's why I say it's just become this political weapon.
So, okay. As far as I remember now from this part, from talking about inflation.
Yeah. So the next part in the film, after inflation, is CBDCs. And the transition that I use, I talked about a bit earlier, is the fact that you need to transition your population into a new form of money because the money that they're using day to day is worthless and is becoming worthless. And so it happens every time, right? This is when currencies are changed in a nation. It's when, you have to change your currency and give it a new name, a new value. And so that's what's happening now. That's what central banks are working on. And they, at the time when I made my film, they were only really hinting at it. There was some plans, what it was going to look like potentially. Since then, it's really evolved. And I mean, it's moving very fast. I think the US are going to have their first CBDC in July already.
CBDCs, obviously, central bank digital currencies, right. Just to be...
Yes.
Yes.
Describe
the difference between a CBDC and a dollar as it stands currently.
Yeah, so the difference is that with the CBDC, it's just digital, which, okay, this doesn't really count as a difference because most of the transactions that we do today are digital. But it's the idea that there will never be a paper form of it. And the reason why they call them digital currencies is just to take the branding that has come from cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and present, show to the population that they're doing something that is up to date with technology.
Do you know whether they use blockchain technology?
So they don't say that, but I'm pretty sure they don't. I mean, why would they?
I don't know.
Blockchain technology is worse for them than just a regular ledger.
The new thing about them, as far as I understand, is that they would be programmable money. Okay.
Yes.
So I take it you can make programmable money without a blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I highly doubt, because blockchain has a lot of great use cases. I mean, mostly one, which is just send money around. But as soon as you want to add some automation on top of it, it's already more annoying, and especially for entities that they control this so strongly. They want to make sure that they can change the ledger if needed. They can go back on certain transactions, and if you just have this immutable record, it goes against their objective.
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay, go back. The main difference then in reality between the CBDC and the dollar system that we're currently on, so, for the average person in the street.
Yeah, of course. The major difference is that you no longer need a bank account with a commercial bank, because the central banks are going to be directly issuing their own wallet. So essentially like a mobile bank account, let's say. And when you interact with it, you interact directly with the software from the central bank. So central banks are eliminating commercial banks this way, which allows them to have a bigger control on everything around money. Because right now, if they decide to increase interest rates, then they communicate this to commercial banks. Commercial banks have a certain amount of time before they can do it. And it's just general to all of their users. The central bank kind of has to wait for them to do that. And with a CBDC, they can just update one, field in a form that they have on their tools, and all of a sudden everyone just has an increased interest rate. And this interest rate can also be different for different people. And if the central bank controls that, then they can directly take action on whatever account. They don't need to communicate this to a commercial bank that'll say, well, I'm protecting my customers. Maybe that's not something I'm comfortable with doing. And it's just this harder process. Like this, they eliminate commercial banks. They can do whatever they want with that money.
It's basically a central planner's wet dream, isn't it? It's the ability to control and, like you say, you could, if you want to stimulate a certain section of the economy, you give lower, you use the techniques they have at the moment, interest rates and money creation, to incentivize particular industry or a particular person. You could be an age group thing, couldn't it? You could, if old people are hoarding money too much and not spending it, you could say, right, you're going to bring down the interest rates on your savings.
Yes.
And things like that.
Yeah.
It's the final incarnation of central planning in the banking sector, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, the kind of things that can be set up with that are just legit dangerous. Because, already today, people that suffer the most from inflation are, of course, the poorer sections of the population, but retired people. They've lived all their life working under this welfare system that assures them a certain retirement pension, and they have like 20 years left of their life from the moment they retire. And during these 20 years, their pension isn't going to increase or hardly, while inflation is going to continue going. And this is why so many older people end up being so poor, even though they've had, this productive life.
I suppose, though, if you're a central bank, you're dancing, you're kind of walking a tightrope between pissing people off too much that they revolt and keeping them happy. And God, I'm a free market believer, and it makes, I can only see that the centralizing force in the banking sector, I can only see that ends in, well, I don't know. What do you think it ends in?
The current situation, you mean?
Well, the situation of, it's like I say, if you look back at the history of banking, go from the gold standard. The gold standard was a pretty decentralized, sharing gold coins around and paying for things with gold coins is as decentralized as you can get. You've got a gold coin in your hand, you give it to someone, that's final settlement just happened. All right. Then some people started getting a lot of gold coins, so they're like, right, I'm going to stick them in this place. Mm-hmm. And that's the beginning of the centralizing force. But still, because the banks were good faith actors, you kind of hoped that they were still holding your coin. So you could go back in there, swap your piece of paper, get your gold back, and you'd be back to being the decentralized money again. But now we're at this point where we are about to enter an age where a central authority, i.e. the bank that used to hold all your gold, holds all the digital currency and basically watches every single transaction that's being made and decides how to address the people, or how it's like social engineering, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's controlling people, the way they operate by what they spend their money on.
Yes.
And that is, that's a pretty dastardly situation.
Well, I think, the problem is that there's two sides of it. because of course there's central banks that are pushing for that. But the goal of central bank really is supposed to be just economic stability. And what they want to do with that is just make sure that money just keeps a certain velocity, which means that money gets transferred within the economy as fast as possible. So people transact as much as possible. And because this is how you make sure that our system continues working, because we're built on the system of growth where you always have to buy. So people that are saving their money are not going in that direction. So this is why with central bank digital currencies, they will have, these interest rate kind of rules, but also limits on savings, right? I think the central bank that was the clearest on that so far has been the UK central bank, saying that with their golf coin or UK coin, I don't remember the name. Britcoin, yeah. That with Britcoin there'll be a limit of £20,000 worth of savings.
Did they really say that?
They did really say that. So that's
wait a minute, a limit. But how do you run a business if you can't save?
So maybe that was just for individuals. To be honest, I'm not sure. But as a starting point, anyway, these CBDCs are going to coexist with the British pound. You can't just
you can't implement that even on an individual level. I mean, I know people that earn more than that a month. What are they going to do?
So that's why, again, this is just during this transition period, because they can't just get rid of the British pound. They implemented this new system. I think it's maybe a way to both secure some individuals, financial situation by allowing them not to go all in straight away. But at the same time, it's also to protect the rich as opposed to the poor, which is, of course, classic, because all these guys, they're all rich making these decisions.
So, describe then in reality what actually happens to you during a transformation like this from, say, person X who is getting, like, let's say, average person probably earning about £30,000 a year doing a job. Has got £10,000 in the bank, maybe saved, and a few loans and all this kind of stuff. What happens to them during this transition? What happens to their money? What happens to how do you imagine it would happen?
So I think that the first step will be giving these central bank digital currencies to individuals that need support from the government directly. So any kind of welfare spending would be distributed through this system, right? So these would be the first target people that anyway, it's maybe hard for them to have $20,000 to £20,000 of savings that would be within these accounts, right?
But so they're going to coexist for a while.
I think yes, of course, yeah. Because also, how many people? I mean, I don't know the numbers in the UK, right? But how many people don't use a smartphone on a day-to-day basis, right? I think the numbers in the UK are at least 97% of the people have a bank account, but not everyone uses them like a millennial does, right? Not everyone has an app on their phone or uses even internet to access their bank account. So, you need to make sure that these people don't get completely eliminated from our financial system. Otherwise, I mean, not that it matters, I guess, but, all of these decades of technological and financial progress would be lost for this part of the population. So I think that, it's going to coexist. People are going to have access to the old British pound and the new CBDC pound, Britcoin. But incentives will be there for people to slowly transition there. And I think the first one that I see, of course, it's hard to say because we're not there yet, right? But the first one that I see is welfare spending and how people are gonna receive direct money.
A bit like food stamps.
A bit like food stamps.
So you give someone a food stamp and they can only spend it in a certain place. I think that's how it works. I'm guessing. But,
yes. But then again, there's the what they're doing in the US, the Fed now. That's what they call it. It's their first version of a CBDC, and this one is targeted really as the underlying kind of network. So between merchants, like this is how they would send each other money. So it's not necessarily for the population yet. It's
what's Fed now?
It's the first version of CBDC that the US is releasing on July.
But who uses it and what does it do?
So in that case,
is it a digital dollar or is it?
It is a digital dollar, yeah, with lower transaction fees and so on. Because again, it's directly central bank ledger, right? So it doesn't have the additional ledgers of the banks on top of it, and all of these systems. So it's one, US Fed account doing a transaction to another US Fed account. And these people are merchants, just transacting between each other.
I mean, it should be pretty much free to transfer.
Yes. Well, and so what they do, and this is how they made a very nice, beautiful video a couple months ago with like these animations and this small town. It reminds me of the Lego movie.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of this genre. And
speaking to the plebs,
yes.
Make it as simple as possible.
Exactly. And the way they present it is really for transactions, but the kind of thing that happens in the background. The fact that when I go to a store and buy my grocery, I just do one transaction, and what happens, in the background is one bank communicating with another, adding this transaction to their ledger, and then at the end of the day or days later, the transaction will actually happen, and the other bank will receive the funds, right? In this case, it's for this underlying element of what it means to make a transaction when you go do your grocery shopping. This would be run with the Fed now for the merchants that, to start with, choose to participate because they're rolling it out, little by little. So you have to choose to participate into that. The incentive being that you pay lower transaction fees. And so that's how you get part of the population, right? Whether it'll be for welfare directly or you get some merchants to start adopting it because you lower your transaction fees because you're no longer using Visa, MasterCard, and so on.
And of course, part of the trend for welfare payments is universal basic income, which seems to me to be another very strong incentive to get you to do something. I mean, like a central bank being able to issue currency at whim means they can issue you with universal basic income, which would be a monthly payment of a certain amount of money to help, to give everyone. That's the theory, isn't it? What do you know about UBI?
I think that, we've reached a point where these centralized authorities are so full of themselves because they've managed to gain so much control about day-to-day things that they believe that what they believe is the only possible outcome. So their argument around UBI is the fact that we're going to have so much innovation that is going to completely change everything and get rid of people's jobs so much that we're going to have to think of a certain model where we compensate people directly through universal basic income. And I think that's just them being full of themselves and thinking that they can control all of that. And they're going to, beat the singularity event that is coming through money distribution, free money distribution. I think, it's a mistake. I mean, if you think of every huge innovation that we've had in the past, and we've already had some huge ones. I mean, internet, computers, steam power, all of this has created as many jobs as it has deleted. I don't see why it would be any different right now. I mean, it's just a matter of people scaling up, and this is what will happen anyway, regardless of what they're trying to push.
How do you see it's a very common meme to think that AI, artificial intelligence, is about to put everyone out of work over the next sort of 50 years. How convince me that it's not then? Give me some concrete ideas for why, for example, doctors will still exist, why drivers will still exist, why, I mean, I would imagine that if you follow the timeline far enough, personal assistant robots will be as affordable as a phone is now at some point, right?
Right.
So come on, what jobs are we going to be doing then?
So I think, I can give you an example of one that I have thought of. It's a matter of sitting down long enough and thinking about each job and how certain technologies work today and the kind of governance systems that they have. A good example is how the Bitcoin network works, right? Because it's one of the first networks. Not really, you can also think of it like Linux. Yeah, it's a decentralized development community, and they get paid by the community behind that. I think, for example, Bitcoin core devs, without them, Bitcoin wouldn't be able to move forward as much as it does now through, different technological progress that just makes it easier to use and compatible with other things. And these people are only paid by the community, whether it's companies that have, they run grants from time to time to then distribute it to these core developers. They're like very skilled people without whom, the network cannot work. And it is so important for the whole community that this works that, they get paid. So now think of something like ChatGPT. ChatGPT today is run by Microsoft, right? Any technology, especially something like that, is going to end up being open source. But what I mean by open source is a truly, free open source software where it is built by a community, it is improved by a certain community. So now, if you think as a linguist, someone whose job is literally to translate things, whose job is to, build dictionaries, such things. Part of their job gets completely eliminated with ChatGPT. But if you have free open source software, you need people to go and audit all of that. You need people that have gained the skills on top of their linguist skills that can go there, check the code, see how certain sentences are being built, maybe work on improving that. And then they could be paid off by a certain community movement. Because again, if you think online, it is all about communities. And I think that being able to, use some currencies such as Bitcoin that allows for microtransactions and such things can completely develop a new world of payment for this type of people. Of course, they'll have to upskill, but it'll be a lot about these kind of things.
My thought, though, with regard to that would be that more translators will have gone out of business than are needed to audit open source code for, translator bots or whatever. Which goes against what you said, that there's going to be as many jobs created as there have been lost. Don't you think that this, and this is going to, obviously, I'll probably eat my words, isn't this time different? All right, look, use your example of the steam engine. Mm-hmm. So the steam engine put out of business people that rode carriages, let's say. So the guy that that whipped the horses is no longer needed, but there is a guy that needs to shovel the coal now,
right,
and put it in, right? But what we're doing is we're replacing humans with AI, aren't we? Because we're basically creating new humans. Like robotics will be servant humans, won't they?
Yeah.
So what are we going to do when there's a robot to do everything other than just direct robots? Hopefully, they won't be directing us.
Yeah. So, I think there will always be human-to-human interaction because we humans will always prefer that, right? Yes. So in one way or another, we're going to, direct more to services. Now, some services are also going to be, of course, destroyed by AI. But I think, we'll find new things. There's just so many new ways of making money online. And it's all based on online, what I'm saying, because you can just reach a much broader population this way, and therefore you can potentially earn a lot less money, but from a lot of different people that accumulates to something bigger. And I think that's kind of the direction that we're going to be headed towards, right? Because sure, maybe in factories, you divide the staff by 10, you still need some staff there. The ones that are gone, they'll have to find new skills. That's what always happens. You just have to skill up. If you thought that you're going to spend your entire life working at the same factory, and I think then, bad news, it won't work. Yeah. You'll have to upskill. And whenever we've had new technologies that came that were going to destroy, everyone's work and no one is going to have any kind of job, that's in the end what needed to happen. The general society just upskilled. They transitioned to something else. Learn new skills and new tools, and you move on, right? It's just and it's a short transition usually. Yeah, we're talking about a decade or so.
Maybe it would be what you would call manual jobs that will never come back. Do you think? They are the ones that technology replaces, really, when you think about it. Even the horse was a replacement of the feet, wasn't it? Of the human foot. Like the train the car, a replacement of a horse. Now we've got self-driving cars. That's obviously right. There's no one in now. It's literally just you getting into a car. You don't even have to steer it. You don't have to do anything. You don't need a taxi driver. Maybe those are the jobs that will never come back. Possibly.
I think possibly, but at the same time, I think it's the kind of job where if you do, if you stay someone's driver, billionaire's driver or whatever, whoever will think that it's something that is needed in their life, then you're definitely going to earn quite a bit of money. You see, it's this idea that even if a lot of the manufacturing is automated, that's the big scale manufacturing. Just the other day, I bought a pipe, a guy that makes these pipes in clay, and it's way more expensive than if I would go buy an industrial pipe. But in the end, there's something to it, the fact that it was handmade, and hopefully we can go back into some higher quality kind of elements.
Yeah, that's a cultural shift.
Exactly.
I agree with that, and I think. But I don't think most people are going to care necessarily. You're harking back to a time when, prior to automation, when everything was handmade and everything was a little bit quirkier and a little bit more sentimental, and buildings even were more, nicer to look at, according to me at least.
Yeah.
So you're kind of envisaging some kind of a renaissance happening.
So I think, yes. So I think that it's, we are going to go that direction for two reasons. First off, a bit of a trend kind of thing. We see that now carpenters are starting to earn more and more money. These kind of very manual jobs are now more, appreciated. And I think, that's just the start of a bit of a trend, right? It's a trend that, you can extrapolate it so much, right? Because we have social networks today. We have YouTube, right? Like, I don't know about you, but me, especially during COVID, when I was just sitting at home a lot of time, working my 9-to-5 job that was more like 8 till 8 job.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time studying Bitcoin, obviously, but also just, other stuff. You're in front of your computer all day because there's nothing else you can do. I started following a bunch of channels that, either repair stuff, either build stuff, houses, make their own furniture, all this kind of stuff. These are all people that didn't necessarily do that previously. They just started doing it, and they monetize thanks to YouTube and other social network, and it allows them to, grow their sales behind it and so on. These kind of economical, circular kind of thing around their whole business and these different business lines that they've created. I don't see this going away anytime soon. If anything, I think it's going to continue growing, right?
It's easy also, from my perspective, to compare the movement towards, say, handmade things, the movement towards skills, real dexterous skills of humans. I can link that to the love of hard money as well. They are one and the same, and I don't think a lot of people listening to this will probably go, "What the hell are you talking about?" But myself, I've noticed that the thought process behind the let's distinguish between a fiat culture and a hard money culture. Fiat culture being the culture we live under now, which is central banks controlling, printing money at will when they want to, as opposed to hard money, which is much more constrained. But the big difference between the two is one gives you the chance to think longer term and one doesn't. The hard money standard allows you to plan for the future because your gold or whatever it is holding value the best way that it can, or at least it's depreciating much slower than currently. The inflation is low. So you plan for the future. So when you build your house, you think, okay, I'm thinking I want this house to be around in 100 years. Now I do connect that with the same thought process that gets involved in, okay, I need to buy a pipe. You know what I mean? Do you know what? I want a pipe that's going to have long-term sentimental value to me. And I'm going to want to smoke this pipe for, 50 years and maybe even pass this pipe down to my kid if he ever wants to smoke, And there's two mindsets at work there. And so arguably your assertion that a renaissance might be coming is connected with money.
Yes, so that's exactly the second point that I wanted to get to. Because, one of them is how we use technology today in social networks and stuff. But the second point is that I truly believe that Bitcoin is the way forward. I think that whatever happens, Bitcoin wins in the end, right? And Bitcoin brings us back to these hard money principles, all while allowing easy and cheap and fast transfers. So it's the best between gold and fiat. And I think that this is what will allow all of our society to go back to this hard money standard, which allows for low time preference and thinking long term. And the effects that this has are huge. The bigger effect, obviously, is on inflation, because there's this idea that if inflation keeps on growing, then we need our products to be cheaper and cheaper, because, of course, we're running out of cash as individuals. So what does it mean? There's centralization, of course, of power, and this power starts deciding about many other elements, such as, a good example, I think, is the food industry, right? Fiat food, that's what Bitcoiners like to call it, right? And the fact that now the food industry, the way it is, marketed to people, is that it's great to buy a prepared meal from the supermarket. Does it matter that it has, 5 different seed oils that are actually, they go through horrible processes to being made, including bleaching and other things, therefore lowering the quality of our food? Does it matter? No, it doesn't. The only thing that matters is lower prices, because otherwise everyone goes broke, no one can feed themselves, and, you end up with a huge problem. If you have alternatives that are cheaper, then that's something good you can push on your population. That's an inflationary world. With Bitcoin, you get rid of that. I mean, Bitcoin is disinflationary until the year 2140, which means that the amount of Bitcoin produced, we know what it is. So the current inflation in Bitcoin, we know what it is, and we know that it's dropping. So this inflation is dropping. And after that point, it'll be deflationary, because no more new Bitcoins will be issued. So from that point on, every product around Bitcoin is going to get cheaper compared to Bitcoin. And I think you can't avoid it. As long as we'll have, electricity and internet, we're going to have Bitcoin. And we'll always have this benchmark system to which we can compare the system we currently live in.
People would say that if your economy is deflationary, people are hoarding money and everything grinds to a halt.
Yeah.
Well, tell me, why doesn't it then? Or does it?
Basically, the problem that we have is that we base our economy on this idea of growth. The reason for that is twofold. Obviously, inflation is part of the problem, but the second problem is, of course, because we base ourselves on GDP, and we need GDP growth. If we don't have GDP growth, then the whole system thinks we're in trouble, and we're, financial crisis, all of this, and it's all based on the this incentive system that our monetary system has through credit, through other such incentives. So the idea is that as soon as it halts, then we're in trouble. And because of how our system is built, that's not necessarily wrong, right? Because everyone thinks this way. So the moment the opposite of what everyone wants happen, everyone panics, and we will end up with financial crisis and other kind of troubles. So this is why it's so important for governments and central banks that live within that system and that knowledge system. They have to fight it at all cost. And that's where Bitcoiners tend to have different opinions, right? Because we think, okay, but we do have Bitcoin. Like, we can protect ourselves this way. We can put aside all the bullshit that they're trying to push on us, and we can just focus on protecting our own money with our own rules, which are, the Bitcoin rules that are, anyone can just, back them. And I think that's the thing, right? It's a knowledge system within economists, within central bankers, that they look at their system from within. They don't see an alternate system that could work. And to be honest, it makes sense. And this is why, Bitcoin is a peaceful revolution. People will get in at one point. Some will get in later. And these central bankers will be the last to get in. Or at least they have all the incentives to be last to get in.
But will they even need to, is my question. And because say the CBDC thing evolves fast, do you happen to know how, what time scale we're talking here? 10 years or something? When do we expect CBDCs in?
I think the EU, they announced 2024.
What, for the first CBDC?
Yes.
Really?
For the first rollout, yeah.
As a Euro CBDC?
Yes.
Okay, so obviously CBDCs will take hold because they're going to give free money, or the free money that they're already giving out, they will give out, as you said. They may even give free money to everyone. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a universal base. Yeah, a bit like what El Salvador did with Bitcoin. Here's $30 or whatever. It would probably be like $5,000 or something. It'd be a lot of money. It'll have to be to entice people. But then can't they just close down the on and off ramps with Bitcoin from there? I mean, that seems like a very simple thing. If this is programmable central bank currency, the easiest thing to do will be to say, well, you can't send it to A, an exchange, B, or whatever, wherever there are on-ramps to Bitcoin, conversion places.
So, I mean, they're already trying to do that, to be honest. And especially now, it seems like they're going a bit more aggressive. Depends where, of course, but the US clearly is attacking quite strong. Even, I think yesterday, they sued CZ from Binance for some of the activities that they've been doing in the US.
So you think that's a conscious thing happening right now?
Yes, I think that's something happening right now. Because, of course, you know, they focus on the negative side effects of Bitcoin, right? And they realize that it's an escape route that earlier didn't exist because, you know, you could always... So there's this concept, it's called monetary leakage. And it's this idea that if you are Turkey or Lebanon and you have very high inflation, well, then you can always sell that currency for gold or for another currency, right? And that's mostly what's happening today, right? And so this is monetary leakage. It's money that is exiting that system because of, you know, high inflation or something else. And so Bitcoin is the best solution for people to get out. And a lot of people realize it. I mean, in places where they've been pushing, for example, Nigeria, they've been pushing their CBDC. And people are against that. You know, it's happened slowly, then quickly accelerated. But they first limited the amount you could of cash you could take from an ATM. Then they unauthorized them completely, right? So you couldn't even go to an ATM and get some money out. But instead, they give you the CBDC, right? So you have first to, of course, level up the tech that you use on a daily basis because not everyone has, you know, the right tools for that. But on top of that, people just were trying to escape towards Bitcoin. And Bitcoin was selling at a premium of around 30% in Nigeria because people wanted out. And I think, you know, it's a good... It shows it. It shows because, you know, we're less of a hurry in the Western world because we have lower inflation than they do because our economy is a bit more stable. And again, we're at the heart of where this money printing happens. So we get the negative side effects later. But they see this happening. They see that Bitcoin is a great escape and people will go there eventually. So they have to block it.
But using the example of Nigeria. When did that happen?
I think it's still happening, but literally 3 weeks ago they were you know, attacking central bankers' homes. And,
right. Well, they're being relatively lucky in a way because if this had happened a year ago, they'd now be sitting on half their money.
Right. If
they'd have bought Bitcoin. I mean, it's down massively. So it's not necessarily the best escape, is it?
So, you know, that's why a lot of people, of course, talk about stablecoins and all this kind of stuff. It's, you know, it depends what we're talking about because their currency has been devalued just as much, right? So, I mean, I don't know, would it have been better or not for them to hold their own currency? I think worse, right? Because they have
something else.
Or something else.
Like gold or like a stable coin or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, you know, stablecoin could be a good alternative at that point. Gold, it depends on what they're doing, right? Because gold can be stolen quite easily.
Probably hard to get hold of as well.
Probably hard to get hold of, yes. Whereas stablecoins are an easier option. Now, of course, stablecoins, you know, I mean, yeah, I don't hold any stablecoins. I think Bitcoin is the safer thing. And that's what I prefer holding personally. But I do think, you know, there's value for people to hold some stable coins there because it's even hard for them to buy US dollars. It's easier for them to buy US stable coins than US dollars directly with their banks because some don't have bank accounts or the banks block it.
Your opinion, though, that it's best to hold Bitcoin is probably because you have the benefit of low time preference.
Yes,
you do, and this is something that people should understand that. You know, fleeing to Bitcoin in a short-term strategy can be a terrible idea. And unfortunately, that's something that's going to happen to a lot of people, I think, and is happening to people. People are trying it and then losing a lot of their money. What do you think the solution to that is?
Taking your time, I think.
Yeah, all right. I'm a Kenyan guy who can't take his time, or I'm a Liberian man who is seeing inflation, or, well, I can't just say, do you know what? I'm going to hold this money for 10 years because I know at least in 10 years it's going to be fine. I need something to use.
To spend day to day, right?
Yeah.
So I think in that case, it's a matter of managing a portfolio. It doesn't necessarily need to be complicated, right? But what can be done is just first approach of, you can even go all in Bitcoin for the time being, because at least, for, the next few days, you've protected your money 100%. And then you can move on to having some stable coins.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you think about, if you're fleeing inflation of 20% or 30%, I mean, if you look at the loss of value of Bitcoin, sometimes, I mean, there have been 20% days where it's gone down.
Yeah.
So I mean, you did really badly. And I think the truth of Bitcoin is that we all know, if you study it, is that the actual price rises, that the significant price rises do happen only once or twice or three times a year on specific days. And if you miss those days, quite often you don't get the benefit. So, which is why long-term holding works. But short-term holding, if you're forced to sell at any point, you run, I think, a very high risk of doing worse than before. And, I think obviously in the long term, it's great. And also the problem even solves itself in the long term, because you would assume that in the long term, when more people use the asset, when more liquidity is in the asset, it also fluctuates less. There's less leverage. Leverage can't have such a large effect on the price.
Yes, you need more money to make a 10% drop, basically.
Yeah, or more. Yeah, I mean, even on leverage, you need a lot of money. So, how do you how do you do outreach in somewhere like, somewhere in Africa where they're experiencing high inflation? How do you go there and say, look, buy this asset, it'll protect your money, but also you might lose a lot of your money in the short term?
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard part, obviously. But I think it's a matter of managing, how much Bitcoin you have versus how much, stablecoin you can have in the case of, staying in this separate world from central banks. And I think for most stablecoin, and this is why in these countries you see that the adoption of stablecoins is huge, right? UST in countries like Turkey or Lebanon is extremely high because people can use it to transact, and it's easier for them to buy this than to buy US dollars.
Do you happen to know if people are actually transacting in the stablecoin?
So, yeah, they are. Yeah,
they're not holding the stablecoin and then selling it for local currency. They're actually transacting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about stablecoins, but can you get a wallet for stablecoins?
Yes.
You can? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Right, okay.
It's like a crypto kind of asset.
Right, okay. Yeah. I of course, Strike has a US dollar stablecoin on
yes,
it,
yes.
Yeah, of course, right.
Yeah, and there are different solutions and people working on wallets that, would directly be integrated with stable coins and Bitcoin, both there, so you can easily move from one to the other, because that's kind of how people have to start managing it today, because again, there's high volatility in Bitcoin, and me being a Westerner, maybe I can take this volatility more easily than someone that earns $3 a day kind of thing.
Yeah. Gosh, just thinking about stablecoins now, that's a real minefield as well, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
What do you happen to know? What are central banks doing about stablecoins? Do you know? Like, how are they dealing with stablecoins and the evolution of those kind of alternative systems? Because they're in direct opposition to a CBDC, stablecoins, aren't they?
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know. What is it? A few weeks ago only, there was the stablecoin called Binance USD that was released by Paxos, I believe. That's the company. They were using the Binance. It was just branding. Like, Binance had nothing to do with it other than the name. And they were sued by the US completely. They had to stop issuing more of this stablecoin because they're now being sued. So there's it's part of the attack on crypto and on Bitcoin. There's also the attack on stablecoins, because that's, if you think for the US government, it's again some of this monetary leakage, but it's a leakage within an equivalent of your own currency, but you don't even control it yourself. It's but there's two sides of it, of course, because the US dollar, again, is something that is spread out in the world and, has a lot of impact on the US society itself. Of course, there's the fact that, we need high inflation in the US dollar, so we need it to spread around the world in order for the US economy to be stable, because you export jobs, all this stuff. But at the same time, there's this hegemony of the US dollar and what it represents. So at least if they're going for stable coins that are US backed, not backed, but US pegged stable coins, well, then it keeps this US dollar atmosphere. I don't know.
But are they backed by US dollars?
So yeah, that's why I corrected myself. Pegged, because they're not
but
necessarily.
Are they backed by US dollars?
In theory, they are, but they're not necessarily. Yeah, that's
it's
part
another form of fractional reserve lending.
It is. Yeah, exactly.
That's crazy.
Yeah, but that's
the whole thing is just a shitstorm, isn't it? It's like they must be like, if you start a US dollar stable coin, it must be backed by actual dollars in your bank at least.
Yeah, but
by law or something.
Yeah,
presumably.
Yeah.
So you don't think they are?
No, quite a few of them haven't been. No,
or backed by assets, then backed by but then the price of the assets is going up and down anyway. So
yeah,
God Almighty, it's such a shit.
Yes.
show,
Yes. It's a shit show. And I think some of them manage it better than others. Binance, actually, they have a bunch of different coins, and on their website they have the list of addresses that show where they're backing all of these assets in, and it's directly on the blockchain. Anyone can go and check these addresses, which I think is something. It's there's a lot of transparency there. But of course, I went and checked all of these addresses, but I didn't go and do the math and see if they actually have this amount of liquidity available for all of the assets that they presumably have. I didn't.
What
do
about
that
Libra or Facebook's cryptocurrency?
This, I think, it's great that it is being blocked, though. It's hard to say, right? Because again, I'm a libertarian, so right. Of course you don't want it to be blocked. But it's when I was talking about earlier the negative effects that we can see of internet through these social networks, I think it would give way too much power to a company like Facebook, and I think this would be just bad, because it's the kind of control that we don't want to give to central banks, because they already have, governments have a lot of information about us. I think, Facebook, it's next level, because it's the kind of information, with governments, we have the approach of you share the information that you want to share, kind of, and the less you share, the better, right? Even though they keep on asking for more. Facebook is the complete opposite. It's, we just share them way more than they're even asking for. And if on top of that, you add everything about your own personal expenses, I think it would lead.
Was it a blockchain-based cryptocurrency?
That's how they originally presented it, but it never came to life, so it's hard to say. We don't.
Do you know why it didn't come to life? Then?
So I know that they did get blocked by the U.S. government. Yes,
because I watched the story in the beginning, but I don't think I ever found out whether. Did they just say we're not going to do it?
Yeah.
Or did they officially say we're being blocked?
So I don't know exactly what Facebook's statement was on that, but one thing is clear is that they just didn't let it happen. They said because in the US you need to register in order to be able to provide these kind of assets, and Facebook, of course, had to register through that process, and it just didn't pass.
You would have thought Facebook could just set up a company in Switzerland, I don't know, one of those jurisdictions where they can just issue it. Really, money is a network, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. Facebook have arguably one of the biggest network in the world. It would make sense for them to become money.
Yeah.
I'm really surprised they didn't do it, because they seem very powerful and powerful enough to just go ahead and do that. And what else? Where else do you go as Facebook? Like, how else do you expand other than by getting more users? And what's the best way to get more users? Become the monetary network. I mean,
yeah. So, I mean, I think if they were to decide to integrate with the Bitcoin Lightning Network, this would already be a better solution, and they would be able to, provide payments directly for their users as well. It's just that they'd rather create something that they control. So, but the offering would be the same, right? It's you can still take a transaction fee if you want to, right? It's
thing is though, like I say, the problem is still the fact that they already know too much about you. I think one of the beauties of using Bitcoin as a currency, for example, is it's a peer-to-peer transaction that no one necessarily needs to know about. As long as we're geographically close to each other, I can send you some money, just like I did when I gave you a $5 bill or something.
Right.
Whereas if you're a part of a network that's then seeing all the transactions, you're as good as using a CBDC, even if it's Bitcoin. Isn't that right? Because really, sure, you have control over your Bitcoin, but the monitoring of your transactions is still as intense as it would be with a CBDC. And obviously they can't tell you not to spend it, whereas a CBDC can. But yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah, I think I see your point. It's the idea that anyway, Facebook would be able to monitor these transactions that you made, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
they own the network. That's what I mean.
Yeah. And that's part of course that would be somewhat of a problem, but it's a matter of seeing how it would evolve, right? Because again, it's a matter of, from the moment you've got people onboarded on the Bitcoin Lightning Network, for example, the Lightning Network is very private. Obviously, if transactions go from Facebook, then they're the node, so they have this information, right? Because they're the ones routing your transaction, so they know where it's heading.
Well, they'll probably route a lot of other transactions as well from other companies, because they'll have big routing channels.
Yes. But I think then what happens is that, it opens the way for people to integrate with Bitcoin. I, as a Bitcoiner, I have multiple wallets. I use them for different reasons, some are better integrated with whatever kind of thing. I just use multiple of them. If someone is onboarded onto Bitcoin because of a company like Facebook, the moment, you start understanding a bit more of it, you realize you can always take this money out. You can take control of it yourself. You can do transactions without Facebook. Is just maybe more convenient with Facebook for some of the integrations that they've done.
Something else that you talked about in the film was ESG, energy, climate change type issues. Tell me about that. Yeah,
so I mentioned it twice in the film. One of them is, of course, when I talk about the control central banks have and, inflation and how they're kind of approaching certain elements. And I only hint at it. I don't get into detail there, but it's about the false incentives that they create by giving money to certain companies, to certain industries to develop this or that solution for, our energy situation, our environment problem, climate change.
Which many people would say that's a good thing.
Yeah, but then, it's a matter of what comes behind it. Because, we've been getting rid of nuclear power, when in fact this is, one of the greenest technologies that we have. Now, I think in the UK last week or 2 weeks ago, they actually changed the definition of nuclear power, and now it's becoming this green energy. So, hopefully it'll push for more adoption of that. But instead, we're going for, solar and wind. I mean, solar is pretty good, obviously, but it takes a long time for the energy used to produce these solar panels to be, recouped. That's the word, right?
Yeah.
Because, of course, they produce very little energy. It's in years, whereas for a nuclear power plant, it can be weeks. Like literally, I think it's 6 or 7 weeks. That the energy produced by the power plant will be equivalent to the energy used to produce the power plant.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In a nuclear
based
power
on
station?
Doomberg. Yeah. Doomberg said that.
So the price to create a nuclear power plant, once it's up and running, can be made back in weeks. Is that right?
The price of the energy used, right?
Okay.
So the amount of energy,
footprint of it.
Yes, exactly, word, right? Exactly. Yeah, it's like 6 weeks, whereas for a solar panel, it's around 6 years.
Right.
And so, instead we're pushing for these kind of solutions that are anyway produced only in China. Like literally for solar panels, the monopoly of production is in China, which don't use any good sources of energies to produce them. So it's kind of upside down. And same thing with, wind. Wind is even less efficient than solar for that, because sun, at least, it's 24/7 hitting Earth, whereas wind is not necessarily always there. So it's these kind of incentives that we're developing these sources of energy that are unreliable and expensive and have a higher carbon footprint than something like nuclear energy. Which, had we transitioned to nuclear energy as it was gaining popularity, it would have been, our world would be completely different today. It would be quite interesting to see, because we would just have so much more abundance of energy.
What's your opinion on why we didn't follow the nuclear route?
So it's environmentalists, and also a push from Germany particularly, because they were the first ones to push for this transition towards.
But why would environmentalists be against nuclear?
Because it's been shit talked. It's just this idea, look at Chernobyl, look at Fukushima, look at and I think Fukushima, first as a note, no one died because of what happened at Fukushima, right? There was no deaths directly related to the nuclear power plant.
But what about radiation?
No, so no one died, full stop. Yeah.
Do you trust that?
I do, yeah, I do, because we've just come to such a control of nuclear power that, factually speaking, it's pretty safe, and I think that it's the best solution that is out there. But it's been, again, just
vilified,
trash talked, vilified, exactly, and I think that this is going to change now, and part of the reason why this is changing is because of the effects of that. Because if you look at what happened, Germany was really pushing to go against nuclear power because they didn't have much nuclear power. France had the most nuclear power, and listened to Germany and the EU and the direction that it was taking, and kind of destroyed their nuclear power.
France, energy. You shut down your nuclear power stuff?
Little by little, shutting down some reactors, and just trying to onboard alternative sources of energy rather than focusing only on nuclear, lowering the export. In fact, in France, they even agreed to, produce nuclear power, and this electricity, sell it to the general European grid for a lower price than what it would usually be. And then France has to buy this power back from the EU and the EU grid. Yeah, it's like, in terms of sovereignty for France, it was a horrible move. And in terms of sovereignty for the whole of EU, it was a horrible move, because we know that what it led to was, relying on Russian gas for all of these energies. And that was pushed by Germany, and even the Chancellor of Germany that pushed mostly for all of that was at the same time, or rather after, his role an advisor for Gazprom. So, all of this didn't happen it wasn't just a coincidence kind of thing, really? Right? It was just these incentives that were created by some people that had high influence, and Germany had and still has the highest influence in the EU when it comes to voting power.
So what about the ESG narrative then, and CBDC? How do you mix that all up with the Bitcoin story?
So the Bitcoin story is about the incentives that Bitcoin brings to energy production. I talk about this somewhat, mentioning how I think the example I give in the film is flaring, and the fact that when you extract oil from the soil, there's always some gases that are released with it. And these gases are very rarely captured.
You just burn them. You
just burn them, because you don't want to release them just like that in the air, because, first off, a lot of it is methane. Methane is 3 times as dense as CO2. So, of course, it's even worse for the environment than just CO2, so it's better to just burn them. But Bitcoin miners now go into these areas, and rather than just burning it and wasting this energy, they're now mining Bitcoin with it. So it's, just these incentives to use more energy, and also in that case clean energy, because of course you're getting rid of this methane that would be otherwise released.
Is that right? So what's the difference between burning methane in a flame and plugging something into that flame to run Bitcoin miners? You're still burning the methane, are you?
Yes.
Yeah, so what's the environmental advantage then?
Well, like the thing with burning methane is that, and I'm not an expert in that, right? But if you burn methane, it turns into CO2, and methane is 3 times as dense as CO2. So getting rid of this methane means, and producing CO2 instead, means that, you know, you're, well, cleaning the energy threefold, kind of, I mean, cleaning the space threefold, because you're just, you know, creating an alternative element out of it.
What you mean though is, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you flare methane, you're still doing a better thing than letting the methane out.
Yes.
If you mine Bitcoin off that flare, you're doing the same thing, but at least you're basically keeping the monetary network going. Is that right?
Yes. But the thing is, you can extrapolate it to other use cases. So one of the films that we also screened at the film fest was The Bitcoin Farmer. And in this case, it's farmers in Ireland that capture waste from their farm. They make it go through this, I forgot what the name was.
Some kind of generator.
A generator that essentially works like a digestive system.
Oh, yeah, I know what they're called. Big. They do call them digesters.
I think so. And so basically, they out of this is released methane, right? Just like a cow stomach works, kind of, right?
Right.
And so this methane is released, and they then use this to mine Bitcoin. But now they don't just mine Bitcoin with it. Actually, they produce energy out of this, and they sell it to the grid. But whatever excess energy they have from that, because the grid doesn't always need, you know, cow poop energy, the excess, they use it to mine Bitcoin. And in Ireland, if everyone were to use the same kind of process, if every farmer were to use the same kind of process, then 40% of the farms adopting this digestive waste system would allow for the entire energy grid to be based on this energy production, right?
Is that right?
Yes. And what's pretty interesting is that up until the creation of Bitcoin, these farmers wouldn't really have an incentive for that, because sure, you can sell it to the grid, but you make more money by mining Bitcoin. So now at least, you know, there's a reason for it to turn 24/7 and just constantly produce this, because, you know, whatever investment you put into that, you're going to recoup it quite quickly by mining Bitcoin and by anyway selling to the grid. So it's kind of how you can extrapolate this idea of catching methane from different sources to lead to a more renewable kind of future, thanks to this additional expense of energy you can make to mine Bitcoin.
One of the most popular detractions of Bitcoin mining is that coal plants are coming online to mine Bitcoin. Is that true?
Yes, objectively. I mean, it's not like it was coal plants that were off that are now getting online, right? Like, not
I do
necessarily
recall
the case.
one instance of that.
Yes, so some instances can exist, obviously. But the thing is that the way the Bitcoin mining incentives are created are such that you need the cheapest energy possible. And fossil fuels are not the cheapest energy possible. Renewables are the cheapest energy possible. And the more time progresses, the more you have to be competitive with the energy cost that you have. So it pushes bigger installations of Bitcoin miners to find the cheapest possible energy. And that's the only market that has such an incentive, basically, because energy producers themselves are worried that, you know, the price of energy could go too low. So, and as a business, it won't necessarily work for them. So, you know,
it could never happen. With Bitcoin mining, they are the buyer of last resort, aren't they? Any producer of electricity that has excess energy or waste energy now has someone who will buy it at a price. Obviously, you may be paying 30 cents per kilowatt hour as a consumer, and a Bitcoin miner might want to buy it at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. But if it's either that or that it goes to waste, then you'll sell it.
Yes.
And like you say, Bitcoin miners have much more access to stranded and wasted energy because they don't need to funnel the energy anywhere. Yeah. They don't need to send the gas or the electricity hundreds of thousands of miles to feed sort of houses. They literally bring a container, park it next to the energy source and work it there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people will still find that most people, when they hear that, will say, but, you know, well, they'll say, that what doesn't Bitcoin mining then incentivize people to mine Bitcoin instead of giving energy to the grid for people to use in their houses?
Right. And, maybe like it could be the case, but at the same time, that's not what's happening.
Right. So it's not actually, that's not what's happening right now.
No, because in general, the grid is anyway a fairly centralized element, and you need to be able to communicate with the grid somehow. And, the less centralized grid example is, I believe, in Texas with ERCOT, and they still have to deal with them, all these miners, because of course they want to get their energy. But so they arrange plans with them, right? If ever there's peak demand on the grid, well then they have to shut down some of their miners. And in fact, there's a whole lot of insurance products that are now being created around that, so that the miners, even if they shut down, they still getting paid, but a lower amount by the grid directly, only because they make sure that when the energy is needed, it will be made available. So they're the buyer of last resort, and the only one that can, for these kind of demand response programs, shut down so quickly.
And that's why they call the Bitcoin mining industry as stabilizing grids, right?
Yes,
because grids have to run on excess energy, because you never know when there's going to be a spike, and in order to buy that energy, you need something that can switch on and off at the drop of a hat. And there is no industry that can do that other than Bitcoin mining, where you literally just switch a button.
Yeah, that consumes, because it's also a matter of how much energy it consumes, right? Of course, Bitcoin mining uses quite a lot of energy, which means that when it turns off, a lot of energy is available. And that's kind of the thing, because before that, demand response programs were mostly for, big industry, metal melting plants that use a lot of energy, but for them to shut off and then turn back on, it's hours instead of minutes.
So sum up your ideas about Bitcoin and the environment then, just because it's something that not a lot of people talk about who are outside of the Bitcoin world.
Yeah, and a lot of people that are outside of the Bitcoin world, they don't necessarily understand this idea that, because I always tell them, well, when I have conversations like that, I always say, well, we need more energy, like we need an abundance of energy. And people always answer, yeah, but you see, that's the problem with our society, because we always want more of everything. I think having more of energy is a net positive for everyone. In fact, there's huge correlation between our growth and prosperity and how we've started to use energy and use it in day-to-day life. There's 80% of the population in the world that doesn't have the same energy status that we have. And if Bitcoin mining can be something that unlocks it for them to be able to press the switch and also have, this idea that the lights will always turn on, because this is how we live as Westerners. I know that if I, click the switch, it's going to turn on or off. Power is always available. I think that would be a net positive for everyone around the world to have the same thing. And if Bitcoin mining is the thing that can allow them to unlock that, then we should all be for it. And there's cases of that happening. There's, I know Adam Back and Obian was, who they're doing a lot of work with Africa, for small communities, small villages, install some hydropower plants. So that's green energy, obviously. You just install a miniature hydropower plant in a stream that flows next to their place. You install Bitcoin miners there, and you split the power with the local community so that they have part of it going to add electricity for their village that they used to never have. And it's financed because in that same power plant, there's also Bitcoin mining that goes for the investors, and also part of it goes for these communities. I mean, that unlocks so many possibilities for, poor communities that up until now didn't have access to financial solutions or internet. Everything that let me think exactly so I don't exaggerate this. Most things that I have learned for my career, and I've done a bunch of stuff in terms of just process working, finance, programming, filmmaking, all of these things, the major skills that I have unlocked for my career were learned online. If you can give access to someone to the internet in Africa and he can start learning all these things and monetizing them online, I mean, for me, that's a net gain for everyone. And we should all support it.
It's fascinating. So you're saying anywhere in Africa where there's a stream, let's say there's a community, as long as they can get hold of the equipment, which might, I'm sure an investor will bring the capital, then you have a way to set up a system that funds itself and gives you electricity and funds basically education.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal idea.
And especially that if you think of how we've organized our grid today, it's so centralized. I mean, I know in Poland, for example, where we're today, if you install a solar panel at home, this energy has to go to the grid. Then you buy it back from the grid to power your home. You, of course, buy it at a discounted price, but it's not that you send out the excess energy you didn't use. You have to send out everything and then buy some back, right? Which is upside down. It's just a result of centralization. In that case, it's all decentralized. They don't have a grid, right? It's, thousands of square kilometers where there is no electricity, full stop. And all of a sudden, one small community pops up with access to electricity. Another one elsewhere pops up. And they all have their own independent energy source. And they all defend their monetary sovereignty by, securing the Bitcoin network. It's quite, it's beautiful. It sounds like a utopic future, right? And that's literally happening today.
Yeah, I'm always suspicious of utopias, though.
Of course. No, that's, because utopias are also the, if we're here always, of course, talking libertarian talk, utopia is what socialists base their entire communication on, right? So obviously utopias are a dangerous element, but when you see this in effect working, I think it's, at least it gets us closer to some positive outcome.
Wow. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good place to end, actually. We've been talking just under 2 hours, believe it or not.
Okay, yeah, time flies.
1 hour, 54 minutes. Before we go, though, I want to ask you the question we ask all our guests. And I didn't really ask you about you, actually, and what you do. You just alluded to the fact that you have been in finance, filmmaking, all kinds of stuff. But if you could take a sabbatical of a year, paid for, every cost will be covered by some benefactor, what would you do? What would you do in that year?
I think what I've done so far is a good example of that, because I quit my corporate job and, I don't have a salary. I'm now hustling, raising money for another film, doing some consulting work. But, when I quit my job, the first thing I did was educate myself even more about Bitcoin. I knew that's something I wanted to work in. I wanted to get involved in the Bitcoin community somehow. And 3 months in, I just decided to make a film out of it. So, it's kind of what I'm doing already. I'm just my own benefactor, let's say.
Right. So you do the same thing, but you'd get someone else to pay for it.
Yes. Exactly.
So what's the film project you're working on then? That you're hustling.
Yeah, it's called The Fight for the US Dollar.
The Fight for the US Dollar.
Yes. The working title, it might change. But the trailer actually was first premiered now at the Bitcoin Film Fest, and I'm going to publish it today or tomorrow, depends when I get a time.
Can we have a quick synopsis?
Yes, of course. So it's about the Western world that has all of its privileges at the cost of the South and the underdeveloped nations. And I just want to present that in this film, focusing on certain regions, Central America, Central Africa, and explain the high-level monetary system that makes sure that this situation stays where it is, and how organizations like the IMF, the BIS, and the World Bank, through their either shark loans or policies, make sure that this status of developed world versus underdeveloped world stays where it's at, and present then Bitcoin as an alternative for that.
You're talking about monetary colonialism, are you?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just, it's such an inherent part of our system that is just monetary system.
It is incredibly predatory.
Yeah.
As well, what I understand, it's a kind of mafia style system.
Yes.
The IMF go to very vulnerable places, lend them money that they can never pay back, and then claim assets as a when they can't pay. Is that kind of the way it works?
Yeah, so that's how it works, but it's also not only assets, it's really economic policy that is pushed behind that. And, the US literally created the UN, they created the IMF. They still hold, to this date, 18% of the IMF fund. The second is Japan. That is quite surprising. They're just, they were grandfathered in, and they hold 6%. So, the US is ahead by a big bunch. And, you see it, the IMF, World Bank, BIS, they're only there to make sure that the US dollar system remains just as powerful and gets spread around the world. Because you just, hook all of these smaller nations on the US dollar. And if they mess up somehow, you just strengthen economic policy, you force them to get rid of some of the welfare spending that they have. It's a pretty bad system, I think, and I want to be able to explain it to people there, but also to Westerners, so we kind of realize the privilege that we have, and then just explain, in simple terms. I don't want to go and explain the whole way how Bitcoin works. I did this in my first film. It's more the idea. This is the problem with our current system. But we have another system that, it's just based off Bitcoin and it just works. What kind of things could we solve in that context? How can Bitcoin allow for this financial freedom? That's the main part. There's, of course, elements of freedom in general, but the financial freedom part, I think, is best to just limit myself at in this documentary. Otherwise, it goes all over the place and a bit too optimistic about Bitcoin. I think you lose people like that. If you think my film, the first one, The Great Reset and the Rise of Bitcoin, of course, I talk about the Great Reset, the monetary reset, and, CBDCs and what could happen, this dystopian future that comes with the Great Reset. But I limit myself to that. It's the monetary part of it. It's the financial independence that people can have, the freedom and lack of freedom that you can have with CBDC.
In the new film, are you going to be reporting on the El Salvador situation? Because
yes.
I was going to say, they are actually doing it. Yes. They are going against the IMF, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be, of course, a big part of the film. But not only, because they're even one of the films we're screening now at the Film Fest, Bond to Unbind, that I recommend everyone to go watch, already, goes in depth in all of that. So I'm not, I want to be able to to explain many different stories. But El Salvador, of course, is an important one because they've had terrible years because of the IMF. And now they're the first ones adopting Bitcoin and really showing the middle finger this way. They're cutting the strings. And it's a great example to use to describe what could be possible for other nations around the world.
Fabulous. Well, thanks for an awesome conversation. And thanks for putting on the Bitcoin Film Festival, because you brought together a really interesting bunch of people here in Warsaw. And I only got to the second day, unfortunately, because I've been doing this since I've been here, talking to people. But I did get to speak to all the directors that came, and everyone had a slightly different view on what's happening. And I like yours. Yours is the macro view,
right? Yeah,
and it's a complicated view. It's very hard to. It's very hard to get across, I think. You need a 2-hour conversation. You can't just say to someone, hey, this is what's going on in 5 minutes. So thanks for spending the time, and good luck with the new film.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be able to host you here in Warsaw as well. Bringing you here, thanks to the Film Fest and the Weekend Capitalismo, I think it's great. And I'm very happy you could speak with all of these filmmakers because, it's Bitcoin culture, it's Bitcoin education. That's what I'm working on too, and I think it's important for the future. And maybe we'll have another conversation in the future once CBDCs have destroyed our world, and there'll be an update on that.
Yeah. CBDC update. All right, it's a date. I'll see you then.
Yeah, thanks.